Welcome to the Continuing Education module on addressing work-life balance issues and wellness, broadening wellness for the generations. The agenda for this module includes the following topics. First of all, we're going to look at a definition of work-life balance. Secondly, we will look at some major domains of work-life balance, and that includes four major domains. They include the organizational policy area, flexible work scheduling, employee service and benefit enhancements, and personal support alternatives. Then we'll look at some integration points for work-life balance issues and wellness programming, and some generational differences and some of those implications for wellness programming, and then finally a summary of key points. The definition of work-life balance that we're going to use comes from Wikipedia, and it basically is work-life balance is a person's control over the conditions in their workplace. It is accomplished when an individual feels duly satisfied about their personal life and their paid occupation. It mutually benefits the individual, business, and society when a person's personal life is balanced with his or her own job. So that's the context that we have for work-life balance. I would also say, though, that one of the things we want to accomplish with this is to address felt needs on the part of employees and to be able to balance off the choices that one makes in their personal life with their work life. And not that we can't make unwise choices in our personal life that have adverse consequences on our work life, or vice versa. We can make unwise choices in our work life that affects our personal life. So it's kind of a dynamic balance, and I think that that's a good perspective for us to maintain as we think about this definition of work-life balance. The major domains of work-life balance that we're going to look at include organizational policy positions, and there are a number of them, flexible work scheduling as an option and alternative, employee service and benefit enhancements, and personal support alternatives that are alternatives that employers can use to help bring some balance into that work-life balance issue. Work-life balance, and this first area we're going to look at is organizational policy positions. And the things that oftentimes come up in this area is work-life balance part of our organizational mission statement? Do we have a family-friendly kind of policy statement about employees that are employed at our particular place of work? Is there a chapter in the employee handbook that addresses work-life balance? Is there a component in performance appraisals that address work-life balance? Does our sick leave policy recognize family leave or the need for the use of paid time off to cover additional sick leave beyond what might be in a designated or a determined sick leave policy? Benefits enhancement policy, and eligibility policy rather, flexible benefit provisions, travel policies, paycheck direct deposit options, Family Medical Leave Act policies, promotion policies, and vacation policy. So these are the different places where work-life balance can be brought into the context of policy positions on the part of the employer and the employer's pursuit of this issue of work-life balance. The second area we're going to look at is flexible work scheduling, and the idea that we have an opportunity to have flexible work schedules, the ability for us to telecommute when necessary, the paid time off policies or combined leave policies, which give more flexibility between annual leave days, sick leave, and leave for various other purposes and reasons. Compensatory time policies, so the issue around is there that ability to work hard for a deadline period and then have some time off to compensate for that amount that was spent in an extra effort. And also the vacation policy area as well. And that also has to do with, do we, in a sense, force people to take vacation rather than leave vacation as an option, and they can sometimes accrue a great deal of vacation, but they're not taking time away from work. So that's a wellness and that's a work-life balance kind of issue that has to do with our scheduling of our work in addition to actually having a formal policy about it. The third area is employee service and benefits enhancements. And we can do a number of things there with work-life balance. We can have something that addresses elder care support and respite care needs. Sometimes there are resources that are available through our benefits office that help us with that particular need, particularly when we talk about the sandwich generation, the generation that may be raising their grandchildren, but also taking care of their elders. And we also have a sick child center. We have on-site primary care that makes it more available and able to be used during the workday. On-site child care services, concierge services, improved access to health promotion programming that's due to the design of our program and helping people that have, for instance, can't attend late in the day sessions or after work sessions, but are able to use different kinds of resources that would be available at other times and opportunities. This is also where the area of learning management systems comes into play, because we can in fact put a lot of the wellness content, we can incent that content, and then that can be accessed by the individual on their own time and at their own convenience. We also have interactive voice response and web-based benefits to make it easier for us to make changes in our benefits or to make and respond to various human resource needs that come up. And we also have car and van pooling as an option. So those, again, are some of the ways in which employers have been able to improve work-life balance issues for the employees that they employ. Also, lactation resources, which was specifically mentioned in the ACA, that requires essentially all employers to provide opportunity for nursing mothers to be able to take care of the basic needs of their children, but also to do things that are going to enable that particular activity family-wise to be carried out in a reasonable fashion. And website resources that can be used to augment or help with specific topics that are germane to work-life balance related issues. The last area, personal support alternatives, includes the use of EAP for work-life balance issues in terms of help and suggestions and advice. In addition, job sharing, options for part-time employment, shift to part-time employment for periods of time, social events, including the family, and support group options. Those are all personal support alternatives that employers can utilize. And in addition, as you see in the picture, on-site massage services. So the ability to have some of that stress reduction, kind of quality of life issues addressed through a massage service. Now let's look at some of the integration points for work-life balance and wellness programming. We're going to look at it in 4 areas: the policy and informational interventions. We can address that in policy and program policy statements. We can also address it in program information materials to draw the attention of the employee and their spouse and family members to what is offered in terms of work-life balance. We can do employee newsletter write-ups around work-life balance issues. In terms of the next area, the interventions in virtual program components, we can actually look at the components of a wellness program that are virtual, that are not tied and linked to a specific geographic location. We can put questions on work-life balance into our health risk assessments or well-being assessments. We can add content to the health risk assessment or well-being assessment personal report. We can look for the opportunity for our vendors to put content in the telephonic coaching process around work-life balance. We can build in protocols that have a series of questions and opportunities to discuss work-life balance as part of wellness coaching. We can include self-directed change materials that are designed to help people address how those work-life balance are being worked out and issues are being worked out in their own life and their own lifestyle. We can provide a coach or a mentor around this area that specializes perhaps in work-life balance issues and interventions. We can have content in our self-care materials that are designed to help us with the common self-limiting problems that oftentimes are somatic complaints or somatization disorder that comes from stress, which comes from work-life imbalances. That's a content and self-care materials. We can do some content on a website about work-life balance issues directly. We can provide videos for loan or YouTube videos, and we can provide links to those. So the ways in which we disseminate information that's designed to help people look at and examine and get some perspective on work-life balance. We can have it as a health advice line topic. So if we have a topical approach to that, to various areas, that can be provided in that health advice line. We can have an audio tape topic. So that's another way of being able to address this issue. We can have a podcast that has to do with this topic or a TED Talk. We can provide a wellness newsletter content around the issue of work-life balance. We can also have content that is focused in the incentive criteria, so that perhaps some of our alternative standards have to do with actions that one takes to improve work-life balance. In addition, we have a number of site-based interventions that can be done. We can do a workshop on managing work-life balance. That's a more direct kind of approach. We can also use a lunch and learn session that focuses perhaps 1, 2, 3 of those sessions on work-life balance issues. We can put content into stress management and resilience workshops around the issue of work-life balance. We can provide a support group, and we can also provide a lactation room or a room for nursing mothers to be able to express milk during the work day and then save that in the refrigerator and basically take that home at the end of the day. So those are all site-based interventions that have an effect on our work-life balance. Enhanced linkages can be achieved through the content and linkages for EAP services. So if our EAP service actually has a dedicated or a designated work-life balance function or activity or series of modalities, information modalities or podcasts or TED Talks or so on, you can build that into the EAP. The content and linkage for occupational health staff, and availability of flexible benefits and services. So those come down to some of the other kinds of integration points for bringing work-life balance into your wellness program. Now, understanding the generations is important for us because of the differences in value structure that exists in the various major groups in the worksite. This is a more extensive one. Ethnicon is the source of this information, and it basically looks more deeply at these 5 different areas. Oftentimes what we see is millennials being talked about as a group, and they are really the combination of our busters and nesters in this particular typology. Now, the workplace characteristics, this goes through the 5 that we've just identified. The birth year is identified here. And then these are some of the issues which cross-cut and are different for these different generational groups. Some of this is tongue-in-cheek, but there's also a lot of reality mixed in with this. Here we have lifestyle characteristics across those 5 generational groups again. And the last 2 are going to formulate what is likely to be taking place with millennials. So the ability for us to kind of use some of this to help us get a perspective on what kind of wellness programming are people likely to appreciate or to resonate with. Motivation across the age groups, and this is where the source of motivation, and this really gets at more of a pay value kind of assessment in terms of what gets built into, potentially into wellness incentive programs. So the ability for us to look a little broader at what these generational differences bring into play for us. Now, the implications of those last three slides for our programming and wellness are these. First of all, much of our tailoring and approach to personalization, I think, needs to be enhanced. So we need to look for opportunities to actually do some of that personalization and tailoring around the differences in values that exist between different generational groups. So that has to do primarily with where we use computerization, how we restructure the various kinds of feedback that people are given along the way when they are responding to wellness-oriented issues. Another one of the areas for the implications is around integration and linkages. So our ability to ask the question for different generational groups, should we in fact provide some integration and linkages which is different? So that the linkage might be different for a millennial than it would be for a non-millennial. Also, follow-up sequence is another issue. So some generational groups are going to want more in the way of nudges or follow-ups. We also have choices and options, and that's a good idea with all groups, but there also is some general insights that are provided in those tables that has to do with how we structure the choices and options. Usability, ease, and convenience is an important issue, probably more important with our more senior employees, the employees that are not in the millennial group. But the millennials will, in fact, expect a fairly high bar when it comes to usability, the use of technology, and the access and convenience of that technology. In terms of technologically sophisticated, that's another one of the issues that it comes into play, and that affects potentially how we and who we do demos for. So instead of just talking about loading an app, there needs to be probably some demonstration of how to set up the app. So that's a technologically more sophisticated approach, and it's done to help us both prepare the individual who's not as familiar with the technology with using it, but also to be able to have the technology we do choose meet the expectations of those that we're attempting to reach and serve. The focused and utility-oriented approach has to do with what is our positioning for the wellness activities and how is utility dealt with. And there is a differential definition of utility across each of those generational groups. We also have a response-oriented. What is the likely response or the best response for us to have to things like questions or the use of FAQs or the ability for us to have a wellness ambassador answer the questions rather than leave it to a website. So those are all different implications around a response and how we structure opportunities for responses. There's also a pragmatic perspective that needs to dominate in this as well, and that means that we sometimes can't, break our balkanize our wellness program by generational approach. We need to be sensitive to the generational approach, but not necessarily expect to have everything crafted to fit exactly the parameters of each generational group. So we do need some pragmatic balance and a pragmatic perspective when it comes to how we structure the generational differences in a wellness program. We also need to remain reasonable in terms of how we approach this whole area. We cannot expect to have extremely stratified programming. We are, however, becoming more capable of using computerization and mobile phone-based apps and mobile phone-based email and text messaging to, in fact, get to a much higher degree of personal fit when it comes to the kinds of things we can do with wellness. Now let's summarize some of the main points from this module. First of all, work-life balance is a critical issue for a segment of each workforce. Not everyone in that organization, but for a segment of the workforce. Work-life balance issues can affect program participation. So our wellness program, if we're not careful, can in fact be adversely affected by work-life balance issues. Work-life balance can be addressed through the use of virtual kinds of wellness interventions. So we have the opportunity to address work-life balance not just in programs that are are limited to the work site, but those that reach people at their home setting or in their after hours, weekends provision. So that's the virtual kind of activities. Some examples of those may be an e-health portal that can be accessed at any point during the individual's week. It may be the opportunity to have telephonic coaching that is going into the home or for a spouse. So there are virtual kinds of interventions. Wellness can address work-life balance issues with some simple integration efforts. So we can, in fact, begin to look, how do we integrate with EAP? If we don't want to do work-life balance in the wellness program, can we, in fact, refer people to the EAP for discussion and help with that issue? So there are some simple integration efforts we can do. If we can identify websites or particularly good TED Talks or podcasts or apps that are useful, that's a way that we can reach and deal with the work-life balance issues in a fairly simple integration approach. The work-life balance message is very compatible with wellness. And work-life balance deals with your responsibility for your life choices, the ability for you to work on those choices to help get balance in between your work and your home life. And those messages, I think, are very compatible. They also can emphasize quality of life improvements, health improvements, well-being improvements. So all of those kinds of messages make them very compatible. It takes an intentional effort to address this issue well. So we don't get work-life balance addressed by a haphazard approach. It needs to be a dedicated approach to address this issue. It needs to be intentional in nature. Generational differences, which do in fact reflect our current worksite working populations, they're different age categories, different generational groups, those overlay our work-life balance issues, meaning that different generational groups look differently at the work-life balance issue and emphasize and want to emphasize different things for each of those groups. Wellness can be the employee-facing platform for bringing work-life issues to a workforce. So wellness can be the forum around which you address work-life balance issues. Work-life balance issues can enrich a wellness program. In addition, work-life balance issues are more of a well-being enrichment. So they function to help us not necessarily with a core health area, but more with a well-being or quality of life, a quality of work life issue. Let's answer some key questions. First of all, first question is, why is work-life balance so important? I believe it's important for us in the wellness field because, one, it's a perceived need for a large proportion of our employees. Depending on the age, gender, the work, and the kind of work characteristics, it can be a fairly large or fairly small portion of employees. Secondly, it's the source of distraction and diversion for a lot of employees. So if we want them to focus on wellness, sometimes we have to meet their more immediate distracting or diverting issue, which may be a work-life balance issue. The third reason is it competes for time and attention. So the idea that work-life balance is in fact in competition with a lot of other things in terms of the choices that people make day to day. And lastly, it's a source of a fairly significant amount of personal stress. So if personal finances are one of those work-life balance issues, that tends to have a lot of stress attached to it from the surveys that have been done of the U.S. employee population. Question number 2 is, how should work-life balance changes be implemented? So if we in fact are looking at how do we put these into place, how do we implement them, I think we want to alert employees about a work-life balance issue, do some education in that process. We may want to roll out 1 to 3 work-life balance changes at a time. We then may want to make it a long-term pursuit so that people see it as something that has some continuity in our work population, our work environment, and our leadership and our work situation. And we want to call it well-being. We want to talk about work-life balance as being instrumental in our ability to improve our own personal well-being. And then we want to remind employees periodically about the changes that have been implemented and why they're there. So those are some of the answers that I would give to the question, how should work-life balance changes be implemented? Third question is, how can work-life balance changes be evaluated? And the ways in which you would generally evaluate those changes are an annual survey, where you ask people in either an annual program evaluation survey or an annual HR survey what and how they perceive the nature of work-life balance issues in their employer setting. You then can also ask for a periodic reassessment. So you may in fact take staff from different areas and have them look periodically, maybe once a year, at what are work-life balance changes and issues, how are they doing, and then planning out what additional changes need to be made. So we then would add it as a planning focus that we come up with on some sort of periodic basis. So those are all different ways that you can kind of look at this issue of work-life balance changes. And the way in which we structure the surveys, for instance, are to ask people to give us a Likert scale response, which means to, fully agree, partially agree, neutral, partially disagree. And then we then ask questions that, this employer is supportive of work-life balance. And then you find out what percentage of them say they fully agree or agree to that statement. So that would be a way of evaluating changes over time in how employees perceive the work-life balance issues. So those are some of the ways in which the evaluation can take place. There's obviously focus group kinds of questions or opportunities. There's key informant kinds of processes for looking at evaluating the work-life balance issues. There's survey-related ways of doing it. And then also looking at secondary data from other systems. Things like any kind of annual morale-related employee survey that would have questions which could be tracked back to the well-being and work-life balance issue. Now that you've completed this module, go ahead and take the quiz.